Hello and welcome back to TerraTech. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about how to make a good hovercraft in TerraTech and just kind of giving some general pointers and build advice. So the first thing you want to think about when you're building something, anything really, but hovercrafts especially, the first thing you want to think about is how big are you going to make it? Whether it's going to be really big, kind of big, medium, small, whatever. Think about how big it's going to be and kind of have an idea in your mind when you're building it out. Because one of the first things you need to think about when you're making your hovercraft is what type of hover plate you want to use. Whether you want to make something big and use the Geocorp or the Hawkeye hover pads, which have the highest ride height. If you want to kind of go for something that's a bit more aesthetic, which maybe not will give quite the same amount of performance to space used ratio as, say, the Geocorp or the Hawkeye, but just look really good and maybe have some built-in adjustment thrusters, you could go with better future. If you're making something smaller, you could think about either the GSO large hover pads or the Venture hover pads. The Venture hover pads are my preferred hover pads when I'm making something really small that is an odd width, because pretty much every other hover pad in the game is at least a 2x2, except for the Terraphobe plates, but honestly, if you're making a serious build, don't use these. They're terrible. They have atrocious HP. Their ride height is super low, so you're going to be smacking into everything all the time, even if they're right up front. They're just bad. There's no other way around it. Now that you've made your choice as to what size hover plates you're going to use, whether it's the Geocorp and the Hawkeye or the Hawkeye for something bigger, or maybe the GSO or Venture ones for something kind of medium to small, the next biggest piece of advice I can give is to build something of a core that you build your hovercraft out from. And when possible, have that core use the Hawkeye cabs because they have the most amount of hit points and are least likely to die from explosions, especially if you're making a very small hovercraft. Bigger hovercraft, it doesn't matter. They're probably going to have enough of a block distance away from any explosions hitting the shields that they're probably not going to be hit. But if it's a small to medium hovercraft, you definitely want to have at least one set of Hawkeye cabs just so that you have as much HP as possible. Second, don't do what I did. These batteries should not be here because they are explosive, and when they explode, it does AoE damage, and it's going to hurt the cabs and potentially destroy your tech, especially if they're the only set of cabs you have. Kind of a general build advice tip is to have multiple cabs in your techs, at least for the medium to big ones. Small ones probably don't need it. Once you have your core built and everything else mostly skinned, we're going to go back over to this finished one. The next thing you want to do is think about the thrust balance of your tech. So, for instance, if you think about where most of the weight is on this thing, it's mostly down here. Up here isn't actually as heavy because most of the others, like the heavier things, are kind of more center line or on the bottom. So you notice I've got a lot of thrust that's actually below the center line, which means the tech will pitch up if I go forward, which is why I need to have more thrust above the center line so that when I go forward, it would end up pushing it down more. So let's do a quick demonstration here. So I'm going to pull these off real quick. And we'll see. If you look, You notice as it's going forward, the nose pitches up, which, depending on what you want, isn't necessarily a bad thing, because if it's pitched up like that, it gives a slightly better firing arc for firing down on things, and it also makes it less susceptible to running into, say, cliffs and walls, because it gives that little bit of extra distance for the hover plates to pick up the ground and try and push off of them. That being said, let's go back here real quick just so we can see the difference. So before it was pitching up pretty heavily. It still pitches up a little bit because I personally like that. However, it's not nearly as much as it was before. So thrust balance is very important when you're thinking about where you're putting all of your propellers, ion drives, etc. And even things like these adjustment thrusters. It's pretty important to think about where they go too, especially if they're the more or less omnidirectional ones. For instance, on this one, I didn't care as much that it actually tilted when it was strafing. So you can see if I'm strafing with it, it actually tilts up in that direction. In addition to the fact that I opted for more of a cosmetic look instead of pure functionality, because you'll notice as I'm strafing, it's still turning slightly to the direction that I'm strafing in. So there's trade-offs and balances in everything that you do. It's trying to get that perfect marriage of form and function, which is a lot harder to do, especially in a hovercraft, because there's a lot more to think about as you're building in terms of weight balance and distribution. One more build tip I just thought of, especially for hovercraft, is making use of the trim gyros. These things will save you so much time and so much heartache when you're trying to do more of an artsy build than something that's purely function, because it lets you get away with not perfectly balancing things. So let's say I turned off the trim gyro on this mall, which is probably one of my best hovercraft. You can see it's tilted, and there's nothing I can do about it unless I decided to put a lot more weight in the back compared to the front, which would ruin the look. So what you can do is have a trim gyro. Or in the case of the mall, it's multiple trim gyros. I don't remember offhand how many it is. Let's take a look. I think it's like 7. It's a lot. Oh, it's only 3. Okay, I must be thinking of a different build. Anyway. So yeah, trim gyros, and also, if you can, try and put them in a place where you can still access them without having to pull blocks off. That way you get a true representation of the weight balance you're trying to fix. A lot of my bigger builds use a combination of hover power controllers and linear motion engines, or some other way to give you this throttled thrust little diagram so you can actually adjust your ride height on the fly and have it stay there. However, in doing so, it makes the build actually a lot more complicated, because now you have to think about not only where all the hover pads are going, but also where all of your potential sources of up and down thrust will be when you're placing your adjustment thrusters. So just kind of more things to think about as you're building. On a side note, the throttled thrust actually overrides the setting for the hover power controller. So let's say I set my hover power down to 0, right? And I have 0 here. If I increase my thrust or lift, it actually turns the hover pads back on and forces them to, at this point, with 100% maximum output. What I actually end up doing most of the time is actually having hover power pretty low or even off, and then only using the throttled lift to control ride height. There are some exceptions, like in the case of the mall. You actually need to adjust it because if you're making a carrier build, whatever you have your hover power controller set to, when you detach your drones, that is the hover power that your drones will have. So just need to keep that in mind as well. Something else that's also very important to pretty much any hovercraft build is this lovely little thing here, the Better Future Stabilizing Computer. If you're making a pure hovercraft build and not necessarily an airship, having one of these will keep your tech from sliding everywhere. So with the stabilizing computer, I can go and all of the thrusters and adjustment thrusters and propellers and everything else will try and slow you down to a certain point, and then it'll be up to the hover pads. You notice they're kind of vectoring forward and back, trying to find that center point to stay perfectly still. Sometimes you can use the build beam to kind of help it out a little bit. And lastly, I would be remiss if I was talking about hovercraft and I didn't talk about the hover bug. So you could trick the game into thinking that ground is right next to your hover plates, or however far away, depending on how far away a wheel is from your hover pads. So I've got this thing set up here to be perfectly symmetrical, and it's nothing but GSO hover plates, some blocks, a cab, and a whole bunch of hub wheels. And with this, you can literally fly around, zoom around everywhere. There's no gyro on this, none needed, unless it runs into something, because it is perfectly balanced since it's pretty much just a box. So you can use the hover bug sideways like this, or you can also use it to, let's say, I wanted some extra lift. Throw one of these down. It can be wheels, tracks, honestly, it doesn't matter too much. So now, those hover plates will think that there's ground literally right there. It may be enough to make this thing rocket off into space, we'll see. Maybe... yeah, this thing isn't heavy enough. Unless... oh, there we go. Okay, it is heavy enough. I just had to turn off the hover pads. So yeah, a lot of the airships that you see use the hover bug to help achieve that neutral buoyancy, or as close to it as they can get. It's a very useful tool. I personally have been avoiding using it a lot. I'll admit that the mall uses it just because in like very key areas to help with the weight, and it's also very good for helping things turn. But it is an exploit, and it is a little cheaty in terms of the amount of space you can get for how effective lift or turning you can make it. So it's up to you how much you want to exploit, I guess. For me, just a little bit, just to make things look nice. Some people like it a lot, some people don't. It's up to you. There's no right or wrong answer here. Anyway, I think that's just about everything as far as a very quick overview of basics and me just kind of rambling on now. So I'll let you guys go, and if you have any questions, comments, whatever, feel free. Take care.